Hello and welcome. The idea that the United States controls the world through powerful corporate globalization is not new. So is it far-fetched to think that developing countries could be controlled by being persuaded to take on more debt than they could ever possibly repay, turning them into the puppets of the US? Well, that's what our guest today argues in his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which spent a year on the New York Times bestseller list when it came out in 2004. John Perkins worked as a consultant for an American engineering company in the 1980s and 70s, saying he witnessed firsthand how poor countries are cheated out of billions of dollars. This year he came out with a new book, The Secret History of the American Empire, Economic Hitmen, Jackals, and the Truth About Global Corruption. John Perkins joins us today from West Palm Beach in Florida. Now, don't forget, we take your questions on the show, and you can reach us at the numbers on the bottom of your screen. John Perkins, welcome very much to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be with you today, Riz. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to ask off. I know you've answered this question many times. It's one of the key ones everyone asks you, first of all. But for the sake of our viewers around the globe, explain to us, give us a brief definition of an economic hitman.
Well, I think it's fair to say that in the last several decades, we economic hitmen have managed to create the world's first truly global empire. And we've done it primarily without the military. For the first time in history, an empire has been created primarily without the military through economics. We work many different ways, but perhaps the most common is that we will identify a third world country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. But the money doesn't actually go to that country. Instead, it goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects, power plants, industrial parks, ports, things like that, that will benefit a few rich people in that country, as well as our corporations, but don't really help the majority of the people, the poor, who are not connected to the electrical grid, or if they are, they only use a couple of light bulbs. However, they are left holding a huge debt, and the whole country has this debt, and it's such a big debt by intention that they can't possibly repay it. So at some point, we economic hitmen go back to that country and say, listen, you owe us a lot of money, you can't repay your debt, so give us a pound of flesh. Sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies, or vote with us on the next critical UN vote, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq. Right. When we fail, which doesn't happen very often, but on the few occasions when we fail, as I failed in Panama with Omar Torrijos, for example, then the jackals come in. And these are people who will either overthrow governments or, as they did in the case of Omar Torrijos, assassinate the leaders that we haven't been able to corrupt.
It's interesting.
So in that way, we've really created this empire.
John, I was going to say, it's interesting as well, you say that it's not necessarily the governments who send out the jackals, that those are now the sort of assassins, the hitmen. They're really the product of private companies now, so governments can keep their hands clean.
Yeah, including economic hitmen like me. I was interviewed, I was really recruited by the National Security Agency, a government organization, but in the end I worked for a private corporation, Charles T. Main out of Boston, and that's been the case for several decades, because it was discovered quite a long time ago that to have CIA agents doing this sort of thing or other government agents was just too dangerous. If they got discovered, it was obvious that it was the government's fault. But if you use private people like me, consultants and private security firms to do the assassination type of work, then if they get caught, you can always just blame the corporations. You can say it was a rogue corporation, whatever, and the government is not implicated.
Tell me about the word corporatocracy that you use in the book as well.
Well, you know, as I've said, we've really created a truly global empire. And an empire needs an emperor. An emperor is someone who's not elected, doesn't serve a limited amount of time, and also doesn't really report to anyone else. And it's obvious that the President of the United States doesn't really have that role, but we do have the equivalent of that in a group of people who run our biggest corporations, and I call this the corporatocracy. Now, this isn't a conspiracy theory. These people don't have to get together and conspire to do illegal things. They all are driven by one big motive, and that is to create huge profits for a few wealthy people who basically own their corporations. And in order to make that happen, they all know basically what they have to do. They don't have to conspire to do it. And they are not elected, they don't serve a limited term, and they basically report to no one, except maybe their boards, but they are on each other's boards, so they really take care of each other in that way too. They truly behave as a collective emperor would.
Now, regarding the first book you wrote, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which was a huge bestseller, you say that you were kept in line for a couple of decades, and I'm going to quote the book here. You say, on telling the story, you know, I was persuaded to stop writing that book. I started it 4 more times during the next 20 years. On each occasion, my decision to begin again was influenced by current world events. What was it that was happening in the world that made you think, I have to tell this story?
Well, a number of things happened. Like the first one was shortly after I left off being an economic hitman, Omar Torrijos of Panama was assassinated because I had failed a year or so earlier to bring him around. And then Jaime Roldos was assassinated because I failed to bring him around. And then we sent a team in to assassinate the president of Seychelles, which is where Diego Garcia Air Base is located off the African coast. Things like that convinced me that I really needed to expose what was truly behind the things that were happening, because all of these were written off as something that was entirely different from what was truly happening out there. And so I started to write this book a number of times because of those sorts of incidents. And each time I went back to other economic hitmen and jackals to talk to them so that I could include their stories in the book. And each time after that I was approached by the equivalent of economic hitmen, people who came in and threatened my life, threatened my daughter's life. I have a daughter who's 25 now, and also offered me big bribes. These are what we'd call legal bribes, huge sums of money as retainers to do consultants' work, but with the understanding that I didn't have to do any work as long as I didn't write the book. And I knew what these people could do. I'd been on the other side. And so I took this threat seriously. I accepted the bribes. I put most of the money to work for nonprofit organizations that I founded to help indigenous peoples and others in the countries that I'd ripped off in the past. So I kind of assuaged my guilt, but I didn't write the book. I kept putting off writing the book and telling the story I knew needed to be told.
Interestingly enough, in that first book, another quote, which was on about terrorism, war and famine that you refer to, you say, this story must be told because today, for the first time in history, one nation has the ability, the money and the power to change all this. You go on to say it's the United States of America. Why, I mean, is it just the United States that behaves like this? It sounds like it's almost exclusive behavior on the part of the USA. What about, other world powers like China, for example?
Well, we really are, in the United States, are like the captain and the coach of the team. There are other players, but we, for the most part, have been calling the shots. Now, China suddenly is emerging, and there's a new entity out there that may compete with us. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, what's going on in the world today is different. It's a whole new beast. In the past, we could look at the world as this great globe with 180 some odd countries, and most of them didn't impact their neighbors. A few did, like the Soviet Union and the United States. But today, really, the geopolitics have totally changed. We still have these 180 some odd countries, but now we could really look at the power base as being like huge clouds that drift around the planet. And they know no national borders. They don't particularly listen to any laws of one country or another. They go their own ways. And these are the big multinational corporations. And they're striking deals with China. They're creating partnerships there, as well as Russia, the United States, third world. So a whole new geopolitics is emerging. It's almost like when we went from having the city-states to becoming nation-states. And then there were alliances, like the European alliance, et cetera. Today we're moving to another stage where truly the power that runs this are the big corporations, what I call the corporatocracy. So it's going to be very interesting to watch how China does relate to this and how these corporations integrate with the Chinese entities.
Well, John, one thing that I should point out is that, in a very rare step, the State Department responded to the release of your book and the information. And a couple of quotes here. I'll start with the first one about, your work as an economic hitman. It says, Perkins claimed that he was acting as an economic hitman at the behest of the NSA appears to be a total fantasy. And going on from there, the U.S. State Department, again, this is a statement from February the 2nd in 2006, says, contrary to Perkins' assertions, U.S. government policy seeks to reduce the debt burden for the most heavily indebted poor countries. And presumably, you weren't surprised that the State Department would come out and say something obviously contrary to what you wrote. But I'm surprised, that if they have the power to do the kind of things they do on a global scale, that they would let you tell your story in the first place.
Well, yeah, okay. There's a couple of questions there, and let me kind of respond to the last one. Why have they let me tell the story? As I mentioned back in the 80s and 90s, I started to write the book several times and didn't because I was threatened and bribed. And then 9/11 happened, and I was in the Amazon on 9/11, but shortly after that I went up to ground zero. And as I stood there looking down into that